So, welcome everyone to This Magical Life. And I have a very special guest with me today, Merlin Hanbury-Tenison. And how wonderful to be talking to Merlin. I was sitting up in bed with a cup of coffee the other day, and I read an article in The Guardian about this fantastic project, this 1,000-year project, led by a chap called Merlin Hanbury-Tenison in Cornwall. And it was just so exciting. I immediately emailed you and you replied and agreed to come on. And I bought your book, which I have just finished, which is just absolutely marvelous, Oaken Bones. And I have so many things I want to ask you. Your vision and your friends and colleagues and wife of this 1,000-year project of creating a whole network of rainforests around Britain is so exciting and so completely aligned with all of the things that druids and people who love druidry and nature-based spirituality and all the sorts of people who would be watching this program will really feel for. And tell me, first of all, let me say, maybe start at the beginning, starting with the name, because of this name is so interesting. Without giving too much away, you end the book talking about the mother tree where you are. And it evokes this sort of image of sort of Merlin sitting under that wonderful oak tree, in that doré engraving of Merlin beneath the oak. That's what one thinks of. Was your dad particularly interested in the Arthurian tradition? How come you were named Merlin?
Um, you've covered so many things that I'm so excited to talk to you about today, Philip. But yeah, so I'm starting with that. I've never really got to the bottom of it. I mean, my family, mother's family, are very Cornish and have been here for. We can trace our Cornish ancestry back into the early 1600s. My father's an Irishman, but both from sort of Celtic nations, and
Mm.
where those Arthurian legends and the ancient pagan traditions are very important and very baked into our kind of our psyches and our history. And I hope it's because of that. I think I'm the fifth child between them that they'd had, and the other four all have much more traditional sort of English names. And I think they finally just thought with the fifth, sod it, we'll go a bit crazy. And I've always been very grateful for it because it's something that I've loved growing up with a name which I feel is very rooted in those
Mm.
Celtic traditions, and it's always served me really well.
That's great. That's fantastic. And one of the threads that weaves through your book is family, sort of family in the widest sense of the sort of family humanity of humanity and our fate, and also your family and families in general. And one of the things that really comes across is your love of your dad, and being a dad myself and a granddad, I when I was reading it, I was thinking, gosh, I would be so happy and proud of my son writing about this project and continuing as well, in a sense, a project, because to go back, because I think that puts it in context, your dad is a passionate explorer, and rainforests have been a big part of his life, haven't they?
They really have, and we kind of joke on this and riff off the idea that he's a tropical rainforest explorer, and I get to be a temperate rainforest restorer, and that there's a
Yeah.
lovely circularity to that. And of course, he goes by the name Robin, but his actual first name is Erling, which is another lovely Celtic name for the Prince of the Fairies. So we
Mm,
both have sort of great names with that lovely history behind them. But
yeah.
I feel very grateful to have the friendship that I have with my father, and extremely grateful that he's still with us. I mean, he turns 89 next month,
Mm.
um, and he's currently in the sea just off Plymouth, rowing a boat as he plans for his next great challenge that he's doing. So he did 8 great challenges on his 80th birthday to raise money for the charity that he founded, Survival International, which has been fighting for the rights of Indigenous tribes for over 50 years now. And he ran his first marathon, climbed the 4 highest peaks in the UK, went to the deepest cave system in the UK, did his first skydive and water skied across the English Channel, all on his 80th birthday. And then when he got very sick with COVID, as he recovered, he healed in the rainforest here and then climbed Cornwall's highest peak, Bran Willie or Brungelly, as we're sort of reclaiming in the same way that the Welsh are beginning to reclaim their Celtic names.
Mm.
Um, and raised a lot of money to build a healing garden in Cornwall's hospital in Treliske. And so now on his 89th birthday, he's doing this long row. He's rowing 25 miles up and down the River Tamar, Cornwall's border with England, to raise money for our temperate rainforest research station that we're building here at Kabila. So he's indefatigable. Quite literally, he is the definition of indefatigable, and he is still hard at it, which is really humbling, but also it fills me with pride and with love every day.
Absolutely, it's so fantastic and so inspiring. When I was reading about in your book about the challenges he undertook when he was 80, and then what he went through with COVID and all the rest of it, what an ideal model to have. I think ideals like that are wonderful to inspire us that it is possible.
He
Um,
sets the bar very high. He likes
yeah,
to remind me when I get overexcited about the fact that I have a book that's been published. He likes to remind me that he's published 26 books, and and the fact that he published his first book when he was about 10 years younger than I am now. So he's very good at motivating me, sometimes inadvertently and sometimes with good intention.
that's fantastic. And you're sitting now in Cornwall,
Hmm.
just on the edge of Bodmin Moor,
Hmm.
in an area, because of course those people who are watching and listening don't know the context yet of we have to tell them the extraordinary adventure that you're on, and the sort of mission you've set yourself, and all of those people who you're working with and alongside. um go right back, if you don't mind, to I mean, the fact that there's rainforest. I wasn't entirely sure that. I think I'd heard about Celtic rainforest, but I didn't really know this in any detail about this extraordinary fact that we do have rainforest in the British Isles. So could you take us right back to the sort of the basics?
Of course, and it's lovely. I think it's wonderful as we start to reclaim this, and it's wonderful this term rainforest in the UK, especially in our Celtic fringe regions, because really those were where the rainforests flourished in our Celtic fringes, and I think it's wonderful to see it become a bit of a touch point and a bit of a catalyst for that sense of Celtic nationhood, which is definitely having a wonderful resurgence. I've been learning about it, yeah, really my whole life, but very much that's been accelerating the last 10, then the last 5 years. And so the background to it is that about 3,000 years ago, up to about 20% of the UK was a rainforest landscape. And I think that term rainforest landscape is very important because we used to have this idea that Britain was a closed canopy forested island where a squirrel could go from Land's End to John O'Groats without touching the ground. That's been
Mm,
quite comprehensively debunked. And what we would have had across the whole of the UK are mosaic and patchwork habitats, of which our rainforest would have been one of those as well. So all the way from the Isle of Lewis, sort of Stornoway on the Isle of Lewis, all down the Western Highlands past Mallaig, Fort William, and Oban, down to Cumbria and the Lake District, and all through that western belt of Wales from Anglesey through Aberystwyth down to Pembrokeshire, and then in the southwest across Exmoor, Dartmoor, Bodmin Moor, the Lizard, and West Penwith, we would have had these mosaic rainforest landscapes that were not only the greatest carbon sequestering habitats that we had on the British Isles, but also a fantastic weather belt, weather generator, and weather absorber. So when storms came in off the Atlantic, they would absorb the impact of those and mean that the east of the UK had a more stable and reliable climate. They also are our greatest biodiversity arcs, and nothing holds more abundance and wealth of life than these rainforests. And they create wonderfully beautiful spaces, which not only people these days can spend time in, but historically, these are the hotbeds and the founding points of so many of our folkloric traditions. These
mm,
are the sites of Geoffrey of Monmouth's Arthurian legends, many of which, as you'll know, were co-opted from older pagan myths.
mm,
The site of things like the Mabinogion and,
mm.
and Tolkien's Fangorn Forest. These were all based on our ancient temperate rainforest landscapes. Lewis Carroll set many of his poems and stories within temperate rainforest. Now, none of those authors or none of the people who wrote those stories would necessarily have called it rainforest. They would have either called it ancient woodland or oak woodland or wet woodland. But now that we're starting to reclaim this term, I think it's a very helpful way of reminding everyone across the British Isles and the ancient Britons that we are a rainforest people who live on a rainforest island.
And does that apply to Ireland as well?
Oh, absolutely. All down the sort of west of Ireland, from Sligo and Connemara through Galway down to Kerry, all of those wonderful peninsulas that jut out into the Atlantic. And that's where still a lot of the really stunning rainforest habitats are. And there are great people doing work over there, people like Ewan Dalton with his Home Tree project, and he's written a beautiful book around the rainforest of Ireland as well. I think that there's terrific grassroots organizations doing work across each of the seven Celtic nations, from Galicia, where habitat, the Fragas Perditas, are being restored by Grupo Habitat Natural, through Brittany, down here in the southwest of the UK and Ireland. In Wales, there's the Celtic Rainforest Alliance. There's a good movement on the Isle of Man. And then in Scotland, the Alliance for Scotland's Rainforests are doing fantastic work. So it's wonderful to see this sort of groundswell of activity and passion starting to bring this habitat back and really put it in our cultural psyche, because that's where it needs to be.
Exactly. And what's the difference? So if there was all this rainforest in these regions in the past, was there also ancient woodland that wasn't rainforest, say
Yes.
further east or something?
So one of the first things we need to break down is what an ancient woodland is. Now, we're very
Mm,
peculiar as humans, especially modern humans who've become very short-term focused. So we classify now in the UK anything as ancient woodland, which has been around since before the year 1600. So anything that's 400 years old or older. Now, in
mm,
some woodland, that might be very old, because trees all have different lifespans, and some trees that are quite short-lived, 400 years will be several generational turns of the wheel. And that's what really matters, because
mm,
when you get multiple generations, you start to get the synchronicity of the way that they mast or produce their seeds. You get an increased mycelial diversity in the subsoil, which facilitates certain forms of resource sharing and communication. You also get that genetic resilience that comes with multiple generations all living in the same place. When we look
mm.
at things like oak woodland, 400 years to trees which can live for 1,000 years is actually still a very, very young area of woodland. And so I think
Yes.
that we love to put labels on things and call it ancient woodland, but we're doing that whilst giving it a very short time span as a designator for that. So yes, in the east of the UK, there'll be ancient beech woods, or a whole range of different kinds of woodland
Mm.
that are very different in terms of their energy, but also the impact that they have both climatically, biodiversity wise, and to the people who spend time amongst them. In the west, it tends to be oak dominant, but
Mm.
there are also hazel rainforest, there's Scots pine rainforest, there's birch. And a lot of the ruderal species, the trees that live beneath the top canopy, things like your rowan, your willow, your crab apples, hawthorn, and holly, these are all very important as well. And these rainforests aren't identified by a single species, they're identified by entire habitat diversity.
Right. Fantastic. Yes. And the particular area of land that which was bought originally by your father over 60 years ago, and where you're now living, you've discovered that it really is very, you've had it dated, you've had core samples taken, and it really is ancient, isn't it? How old is it?
That's right. So we work very closely with the Eden Project, who are very near to us on Bodmin Moor. They're about 20 minutes away. And Tim Smith, who's the patron of the Thousand Year Trust and who founded the Eden Project, loves to say this is the only place in the world where you can be in both a tropical and a temperate rainforest within 30 minutes of each other, which is really lovely.
Yeah.
They've got a great scientific team there, and they came and did this long form paleobotanical peat core surveying here. And we're able to identify that the valley here is about 4,000 years of uninterrupted rain or forest cover, which does put it in a class all on its own, which is very special.
That's stunning, isn't it? That's extraordinary. And in your book, you tell the story of this land by bringing in your personal story, which is very moving. And you were in the army. You served in Afghanistan. There was a mine that went off when you were sitting in your tank, and it's an extraordinary story. And the contrast between the landscape of Afghanistan, of course, the dust and the dryness and the heat is very powerful in the book. Um, I don't think I'm spoiling any reader's experience of it, by the way, by saying this, because you start off with this, and it's very strong. And you basically here you suffer a breakdown, essentially PTSD from your experience, as so many people have, and you find healing in the rainforest. You go home and you heal. And then you tell your wife's story as well, and your family's story, where also healing takes place in the rainforest. And it's like that. I guess it's an interesting experience of how out of uh, difficulty, out of wounding, that the sort of wounds that we get in life, the pain and suffering, good can come, because out of that, ironically, if you'd had a really good, when I say good time, I mean if you'd had a sort of successful time in Afghanistan, you might have carried on in the army. You and your wife sort of discovered the healing power of the rainforest, and it's as if it spoke to you and you began this incredible project. And so tell us now about what you did when you, once you'd kind of healed, once you'd both healed, what did you do next?
Well, you make a great point, and it's also worth noting, and I do say this in the book, that firstly, I don't attribute the mental breakdown that I had entirely to my experiences in Afghanistan. I think they were, of course, a contributing factor, but
Mm,
they're also it's quite an exclusive experience. It's something which not many people have been through that,
mm,
understandably, and I'm glad that not many people get to go through that. But
yeah.
but in the same way, I feel a lot more of the mental health challenges that I suffered were contributed to by a much more common scenario, which was working in a very fast paced and unpleasant urban environment. And I felt nothing in terms of the vulnerability and the fragility that came until 10 years after I had been blown up in a roadside bomb. So I was blown
Mhm.
up in 2007. It was 2017 when I
Wow.
started to
Okay.
struggle.
Yeah.
And that can be quite common with things like PTSD and other mental health challenges, is that it takes time for the incident to kind of percolate and fester and grow. And I did consider staying in the military, and I had a very happy military career. I very much enjoyed my time. I was serving with a brilliant regiment, which was my brothers in arms. I very much consider a huge amount of affection and gratitude to them. And when I left the military, it had nothing to do with anything that had happened to me from a mental health perspective. I still hadn't begun to experience any of that. It was when I was working in the middle of a city in a very sort of, in many ways, unpleasant environment that I began to struggle. And then when Lizzie and I moved down to Kabila and took over this relatively small family farm, this isn't a vast estate that generates
It's
lots
about
of money.
200 acres or 220
Yeah,
acres or something.
it's about
Yeah.
250, including the rainforest, and
Yeah.
that's about one third rainforest, about 75 acres of rainforest, and then it's about 160, 165 acres of grazing land, which is a small area of land.
Mm,
And farming is really at the tip of the sword of the pain that is being felt economically at the moment. Farmers on the uplands with small farms like mine are not finding it easy to continue their existence and their livelihoods. The average age of a farmer up here on Bodmin Moor is about 62. And they take a huge amount of their income from European subsidies, which are all ending in the next few years.
mm,
And I think it's a very difficult, we're one of the few countries in Europe that hasn't started to see land abandonment in some of the more challenging areas to farm. In places like Romania, they are seeing huge areas of land in the
mm,
east of the country abandoned because they're no longer profitable. It's the same in Spain. It's the same all over Europe. We are yet to see that. Land prices are still artificially inflated. And when we do begin, if we do begin to see it, and I hope we don't, it'll be in these upland areas in our Western Celtic fringes, places like the hills and valleys of Wales or Cumbria or the Highlands or the Southwest, where we first begin to feel that, because it's very difficult land to farm. It's very unprofitable in many ways. So when Lizzie and I moved down here, we were trying to figure out how to make a living from this land and how to raise a family here. And all of the environmental or the agricultural consultants, especially, that I was talking to, all were coming at me with the same easy narrative, which was, well, you have to maximize the amount of land that you can grow food on. So the first thing you have to do is cut down this inconvenient area of woodland in the valley. Now, some of it
mm,
is protected, so we couldn't, but some of it isn't. And we were told that we needed to cut that down. And the more that at the same time, both Lizzie and I were spending time in this valley, really absorbing the healing powers of it and re-falling in love. Because I grew up in the valley, so I've always loved this forest,
mm,
and was taught all about the trees and habitat by my father. But as I began to re-fall in love with it, and not just love it, but realize how important it is, the idea of cutting it down went from being a crime to being a sin to being utterly unthinkable. And
mm,
so that was really when we began to try and flip the model on its head and say, See, the grazing land, which we are all slightly indoctrinated in the UK to think of as the right way for land to be. When we drive across places like Bobbin Moor and Dartmoor, we see these windswept sort of brown and green hills without a
Yeah.
tree and just lots of sheep on them. And we think this is our cultural identity. We think this is healthy. But actually, it's a bit of a green desert. And it's not historically what that landscape would have looked like. And many of the animals that we are husbanding across it, like sheep, for example, are not an animal that is indigenous to this landscape and has been brought in from the deserts of Mesopotamia and Persia and then bred to be more resilient. And I think what we have done is quite peculiar as humans. And the more I learned about that, I wanted to see if there was a way we could take this model and maybe flip it on its head, maybe challenge the status quo of saying, to make more money, if you have a farm, you need to cut down as many trees as possible and put on as many animals for meat or milk or wool, and start to go, well, what about if we try to reverse that trend and perhaps plant more trees and perhaps return a rainforest landscape, a mosaic, and not take land out of farming, not say we're going to take farmland and turn it into forest, but examine whether we could begin an agroforestry model that restored nature, sequestered carbon dioxide, did our bit against climate change, returned biodiversity, provided beautiful places for people to spend time, and also produce food. And whether that might be not only a better thing to do ecologically, but also a better thing to do economically. And that is the blueprint that we've been working to create here.
Yes, and in fact, I mean, I learned so much in reading about the sort of mad system we've developed,
Mm.
and the problems with the common agricultural policy, and just the foolishness really of it that gradually has obviously accumulated over the years until it's become a system that everybody thinks is normal, but is actually just not sensible. And there's really interesting material in there. I think about the different animals and working in agroforestry, as you say, for the reader to discover. But in addition to that, though, you also decided to open the forest up for people to experience the kind of healing that you both experienced. Tell us about that.
Absolutely, and yeah, I'm a huge believer in the right to roam movement in the UK. I think we have a very strange system here where so much land is in private ownership and so much land is locked off from people. And I think that it's really important that at a time that we are living through a mental health pandemic and an obesity pandemic, both of which can be mitigated by better access to accessible and appropriate nature, I think that it's really important that we start to look at this in a very objective way. And I sat in exactly that place where there's a valley here with rainforest in it, which my father bought in 1960, and therefore no one else comes into it. It is quite inaccessible, so that it's not only because it's privately owned, it's also just not natural for people to try and come here because it's quite hard to
Hmm.
find. But
Yeah.
I got huge healing from it. So did my wife. So did my father. And we were thinking, well, how do we facilitate more people coming into it? Now, at the same time as we were building this plan, we were watching areas like Wisman's Wood on Dartmoor, which is quite a well-known area of temperate rainforest, be very damaged during the COVID pandemic, as more and more people weren't traveling abroad, were exploring their local nature, and that's a wonderful thing. But we're very bad in the UK at informing, educating, and helping people to access
Hmm.
nature in a responsible way. And Wisman's was quite badly damaged. It's now sections of it have had to be closed off. People were going in there and stripping moss off the trunks of trees and removing lichen. And some of these species take centuries to colonize and translocate to trees. And so it set that habitat back by quite an amount of time, which was very
Hmm.
unfortunate. So we were going, well, we were thinking, how do we create a balance? How do we bring as many people into the valley as possible, but always view the rainforest within this valley as our principal client? And so we always see the rainforest restore and grow and improve in complexity, diversity, and harmony, not degrade because humans are benefiting. And I think that's a really hard balance to draw. So over the last 4 years, we've brought a bit over 3,000 people into the valley
Hmm.
on these retreats where they come in and they spend time healing underneath the embrace of the oaks. But we're also re-establishing 100,000 trees. We're also watching as the river improves in quality with the introduction of species like the beaver, as we start to see various small mammal and mid-sized mammal species return, as we see the abundance of epiphytes within the canopy improve. So we're trying to make sure that both improve at the same time. It doesn't have to be one to the detriment of the other. And it feels like in a lot of the conservation world, or a lot of these debates, that's what happens. We say we need to open this up for humans, and
Hmm.
we have totally open access. And we've seen this with the Instagram age, where you get certain sites which are very photogenic, and
Yeah,
they become degrade. I mean, I remember the first time I heard about this was after the movie The Beach came out, and that
yeah,
beach in Thailand was then absolutely trashed by people going on pilgrimage to be in this beautiful space. So either nature is opened up and it becomes very damaged by over human interaction,
yeah,
or we go, this has to be protected because it's precious and it's totally fenced off and humans aren't allowed in at all, which I think is just as bad. And it's
yeah.
about walking that tightrope in the middle of saying, how do we bring as many people in here as possible, facilitate their healing, but also ensure that we're creating healing for the habitat as well.
That's so sensible, isn't it? I mean, it's just common sense. Fantastic that you've been able to do it. I mean, you've planted, I think, 40,000 trees already.
Remaining 60,000 are coming back by natural regeneration.
Yeah. And you gave stats in the book. You talked about how these sort of mass tree planting campaigns that we read about in the papers, and you think, oh, that's wonderful. Turkey's planting 11
Yeah,
million trees, whatever. And of course, most of them die because it's a monoculture, and the trees aren't looked after, and you know tree projects that are perhaps are smaller and are able to be carefully and consciously managed seem so important, and it's fantastic that you're doing.
I agree, and I also think it's again it's attached to this sort of short termism and rising kind of attention deficits, information absorption that we have in certainly in the West, where the younger people now are getting their news from Instagram or TikTok or Facebook, and it's all little short snippets. And we love these kind of headline terms. Turkey plants 11 million trees.
Yeah,
China's planted several billion in its Great Green Belt. These headline figures, which we go, oh, that's great, and then we can feel a little bit better.
yeah,
But it's
exactly.
you dig it a little bit deeper, and we're very lucky to have fantastic planting partners here. A brilliant Cornish organisation called Plant One, who are not only have planted all of our trees, but are also taking on a 10-year long management contract where they will protect, restore, and keep those trees alive. Because planting a tree, it's pretty easy to do. You dig a hole, you put a tree in, you bury it, you
Yeah,
cover it over. But the next 10 years of that tree's life, especially in a time with a more volatile climate where we don't know when we'll have droughts or floods, we don't know what diseases and pests we're going to suffer from more. It's actually it's the next 10 years that are the really challenging. It's a little bit like having a child. Actually, the
yeah.
initial point of inception is
It's pretty easy. Yes,
not
that's
the
right.
easy part. It's the first 10 years of that child's life, which are really challenging. And I think we need
Yeah,
to view trees a bit more in that way as well. It's very easy to get impressive headline statistics, but actually getting to the point where the work has been done is more enduring, which goes back to the point of the naming of our charity, the Thousand Year Trust, and this initial project, the Thousand Year Project, is that we've moved into this very strange cycle of obsessing over short termism. Our political cycle, our corporate cycles force us to view what can be achieved in 2, 3, maybe 5 years. You see headlines sort of going, "Can we fix climate change by 2030?" No, we
it, it,
can't. It's
exactly. I remember 2025 being a sort of key number. Will we? And then you think, oh well, we're here, and
yeah.
it seems all right from around here, and of course we know it's not all right, but you know what I mean. It's really counterproductive, I think. And in fact, I love the way the book ends with your vision for looking across 1,000 years. I think you've struck the balance really well between giving a vision of how it could be, with essentially this a patchwork of rainforest areas spreading across the country, and people adapting the way they live, and climate change being mitigated, and so on. But also being aware of how that might not happen if we carry on making the sort of fateful decisions that we seem to be making, and how bad it could be. So not presenting a sort of rosy spectacle vision, but you are also holding out hope too, that it's possible that if we really try hard And in the end, I think that's what one has to do in life, in one's own personal life, and in society as well. You have to be sort of realistic and say, well, things are pretty grim, and that, all sorts of things could go wrong, but we're still going to hold on to this vision and keep working at it.
I agree. I think you're what you say is so right, and optimism is important. Realistic optimism and hope are so
Mm,
important. We are a species with an incredible capacity for innovation and creating wonderful things. We're also a species with a huge capacity for destruction. There's about 8
mm,
billion of us on the planet now. We can do either, and we can make that choice. And the work that you're doing, and also people like Merlin Sheldrake, who you mentioned, and his father Rupert
mm,
Sheldrake, who's been talking about these
mm.
subjects for a long time, they're
Yeah.
great visionaries in this movement. And what I believe we realize is not only that this short termism doesn't help. When we say 2025 is a vital year in the fight against climate change, and then 2025 comes and goes, and we are seeing a lot more globally, global issues, but we're also able to continue our lives with our heads buried in the sand, it doesn't
Yeah.
help.
Yeah.
And I also think it doesn't help the amount of sort of intangible or nebulous scientific information that's been put out there. It's a little bit like the Brexit debate. It was so complex that
Mm,
the most people, myself included, couldn't understand all the ins and outs.
mm,
And it's the same with the IPCC reports. We can't understand it. And that's where I believe the important next step, which I try and talk about a little bit in my book, is around the connection of the scientific and also the spiritual elements, and how we interlace these together in a non-conflict way. And we used to live in a world where we looked downwards at the earth and Mother Nature and realized that the seasons were important for providing us with food, that the forests were important for providing us with shelter, and that the rivers were important for providing us with clean water. We've then flipped to this strange world where we look upwards and we disregard and disrespect what's beneath our feet, which is the only thing keeping us alive, in
mm,
order to either worship or focus on some larger idea, whether it's a monotheistic god or whether it's an idea around capitalism or globalization. And I
mm,
believe that what we need to do is find a way to interlace these two ideas together. The head is very much understanding, when it has the time to do it, that climate change is very real, that rainforests are hugely important, that all of our pinnacle habitats globally are of vital importance. What we need to do is recapture that heart space, because
yeah.
if we don't do that, I don't think the work will happen. We will all continue with our lives knowing how important this is and doing the destruction we're doing, unless we truly fall in love with our wild and native spaces. And that's where the old pagan traditions, the druidic traditions, the folkloric stories that we all used to sit around campfires learning as children for centuries past, need to come back. Because, and this is my whole point around scientific research, is I believe that we will only truly love these spaces. We'll only truly love our planet when we
Mm.
understand it better, and we'll only understand it better when scientific research is done better. But it also needs to be complemented by storytelling.
Fantastic. Yes, I mean that isn't that wonderful. I completely agree with you, and that's what you do. When I remember your first, I think your first group of people you took into the rainforest were a group of NHS, nurses and doctors who'd been, burnt out through COVID, working in the pandemic and so on. And if I understand it correctly, what you do is you've created this beautiful setting with where people can stay and they can be nourished and they can just heal. Do you offer retreats? I can't remember now. Retreats. Can people go onto your website and book a retreat, or do they have to be part of an organized group that?
We do a small number of our own retreats, but not many of them. That isn't, and I'm very cognizant of the fact that I'm not a retreat facilitator. Neither is
Mm,
my wife or our team here. We're
mm,
trying to create a space where experts can bring their people. So
okay. Yeah.
95% of what we do is either a business or an organization or a retreat facilitator bringing their community here. And yeah, as you mentioned, Philip, the passion from the start was to bring veterans groups, NHS groups of people who really needed this space and probably wouldn't be able to access it otherwise. And we've done quite
Mm,
a lot of that type of work, which is very, very fulfilling and heartwarming.
mm,
But we
yeah.
also work with businesses who want to come here. We also work with the more traditional wellness industry, with people like yoga practitioners, Pilates, breathworks, and sound therapists. And it's
Mm,
wonderful to see the diversity of groups who come here,
yeah.
and make use of the valley in a way that sees the valley improve at the same time.
Yes. Fantastic. Well, and the website, is it kabila.com?
KabilaCornwall.com. So there's two. There's sort of the retreat side of things, which is our retreats business, and that's www.kabilacornwall.com. But then the area that I'm most heavily involved in now is our charity, which is really focused on the restoration of the space and the research
Yeah,
of it, which is the Thousand Year Trust, and that's www.thousandyeartrust.org.
great. And we'll put that in the notes for this episode, and we'll also put a note up about the book, Our Oaken Bones: Reviving a Family, a Farm, and Britain's Ancient Rainforests. Really tremendous book.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Merlin. So much looking forward. I really have to come down to Cornwall,
You
make a
must.
trip all the way there, the pilgrimage to Kabila. That sounds a wonderful thing to do. And thank you so much for talking with us today.
Thank you, Philip.
Okay. Goodbye, everybody. And I hope you enjoyed this episode of This Magical Life and look forward to seeing you again.